She was only 16, a girl caught in that fragile space between childhood innocence and the responsibilities of adulthood, but already her spirit carried the quiet strength of someone who had endured far more than her years should allow. Her face was soft, eyes wide and luminous, and though her hands were often calloused from work, they still moved with a gentleness that revealed the heart within her. She had been known in the village since she was small as the girl who always smiled, even when she had nothing, the one who would give away her last piece of fruit to a hungry child or share her cup of water with a tired traveler. Children ran to her when they were frightened or in need of comfort, and the elders sometimes said her voice, when she sang, carried a calming power, like the river's hum beneath the moon. Yet, behind that kindness and innocence, there was also loneliness, a hidden ache that only she herself could feel. Her life within her stepmother's household was far from easy. While others in the village had mothers who cared for them with warmth and protection, she had been left with a woman who looked at her with eyes of suspicion and disdain. The stepmother's own children, her step-siblings, were showered with affection and favor, dressed in finer cloth, given the choicest meals. They taunted her openly, mocking her tattered clothes and laughing when she was scolded. Whenever something went wrong in the house, a broken pot, a missing portion of food, a fire that burned too low, the blame was laid squarely at her feet, no matter how little sense it made. She bore it all quietly, her lips pressed into silence, for she had long learned that defending herself only drew harsher punishment. Each day she rose before the first rooster crowed, stepping into the chill of dawn to fetch water from the stream. Her small frame carried pots heavier than she should have managed, yet she carried them without complaint. From water she turned to sweeping, grinding grains, tending the fire, and then working the fields or fetching firewood. From morning to night, her life was a rhythm of labor that seemed endless. Yet, though her stepmother thought to crush her spirit with this toil, the girl somehow found ways to keep a spark alive within herself. As she worked in the fields, she sometimes paused to let her fingers brush over wildflowers, whispering little songs only she could hear. At night, when the others had gone to sleep, she sometimes lifted her eyes to the stars and imagined a life where she was free. Free from blame, free from chains of cruelty, free to live as her heart longed to. The villagers watched her, though most turned away from her suffering, fearful of her stepmother's sharp tongue and influence. Some pitied her silently, whispering among themselves about how unfairly she was treated, but they offered no hand to ease her burdens. Others, out of jealousy, sided with the stepmother, glad to see the girl brought low because her beauty and kindness reminded them of their own shortcomings. To them, her gentleness was weakness, her silence was submission, and they laughed to see her walking barefoot through the village, carrying firewood twice her size. They never saw the quiet strength that burned beneath her skin, the resilience building in every moment of humiliation and hardship. Despite everything, the girl held no bitterness in her heart. She continued to greet even the cruelest villager with courtesy. When she passed by hungry children, she shared what little she had, and when she saw old women struggling with heavy loads, she offered to help, even if it meant adding more weight to her already weary body. It was as though kindness flowed naturally from her, untouched by the poison of her daily mistreatment. Yet deep within, where no one could see, she longed for freedom. She longed for a day when she would not wake to harsh commands or stifled laughter at her expense, a day when she could walk proudly through the village without shame. She longed for love, the simple human kind of love she saw between mothers and daughters, between siblings who cared for each other. Her dreams were often her only escape. She imagined herself walking beyond the borders of the village, finding lands where people valued her, where she could learn and grow, where she could be embraced for who she was. Sometimes as she lay awake at night, she wondered if the stars themselves could hear her prayers. She whispered her wishes to them, asking if there was a destiny waiting for her, if there was a reason she had been born into so much suffering. And though no voice ever answered, she felt in her heart that she was not meant to remain trapped forever in this cycle of pain. It was this hope, fragile yet unbroken, that set her apart from those around her. The villagers saw only a weary girl in tattered clothes, but inside her lived a spirit that refused to be destroyed. This spirit, though she did not yet know it, would one day rise with the power of forces far greater than the cruelty of her stepmother or the scorn of jealous neighbors. For now she was just a girl, innocent, kind, and enduring, but already her fate was moving silently toward the trial that would test her, and through that test reveal the extraordinary truth hidden in her soul. Her stepmother's heart had long been poisoned with envy, and though the girl never raised her voice nor lifted her hand in defiance, the woman saw in her a rival rather than a child. At first it was the girl's beauty that unsettled her. Even clothed in rags and covered with the dust of labor, the girl's face shone with a radiance that no cruelty could dim. Strangers passing through the village sometimes paused to remark upon her gentle features or the grace with which she carried herself. Each compliment struck the stepmother like a thorn, piercing deeper into her pride. How could this orphan girl, with no wealth and no protection, command such admiration? The stepmother began to fear that one day her own daughters would be overshadowed, their prospects dimmed by the presence of a girl she despised. Greed festered alongside envy. The girl's father had once owned fertile land and livestock, but when he died, much of it fell into the stepmother's hands. Still, she feared that if the girl grew older and claimed her rightful inheritance, her own control would weaken. Every time the girl lifted her eyes to the horizon or paused to gaze at the stars, the stepmother imagined she was plotting escape, or worse, dreaming of a future where she might return to take what the woman now held. In her bitterness, the stepmother convinced herself that the girl was dangerous, a threat that must be crushed before it could bloom into strength. The stepmother's daughters mirrored their mother's cruelty, not from their own hatred but from a spoiled sense of entitlement. They mocked the girl for her worn clothes, delighted in sending her on errands that left her limping and sore, and laughed when she stumbled under the weight of heavy loads. Their mother encouraged their malice, whispering into their ears that the girl was cursed, that her patience and silence were nothing but tricks to deceive others into loving her. Over time they began to believe it. The girl's very goodness became, in their eyes, a weapon aimed at their own pride. The villagers were not blind to what was happening, but their silence spoke volumes. Some feared the sharp tongue of the stepmother, who wielded gossip like a knife. Others quietly agreed with her hatred, jealous of the girl's unyielding kindness and the way even the animals seemed gentler in her presence. When goats strayed from the herd, they followed the girl home without struggle. When children fell and scraped their knees, it was her hands that soothed them, and they returned to play as though pain had never touched them. These small miracles unsettled many, and instead of admiring her, they whispered that perhaps she had inherited powers from ancestors long feared, that maybe she was not as innocent as she appeared. This isolation only deepened the stepmother's resolve. She began to spread her venom with more confidence, planting seeds of suspicion wherever she went. She told the villagers that the girl's beauty would bring misfortune, that her silence was a sign of hidden rebellion, that her dreams of freedom were acts of defiance against the order of the household. Bit by bit, her words seeped into the minds of others, until even those who once pitied the girl began to doubt her. When something went wrong in the village, a sick animal, a sudden storm, a missing item, it was easy to lay the blame at the feet of the one who could not defend herself. The girl felt the weight of this suspicion like a shadow that followed her wherever she went. She noticed how conversations quieted when she passed, how mothers pulled their children closer, how men shook their heads as though warning her away. She could not understand it, for she carried no malice in her heart. Yet each day she endured more scorn, and each day her stepmother's eyes grew colder, more calculating, as though she were measuring the girl's life against her own ambitions. In the quiet of night, when the girl lay awake beneath her thin blanket, she sometimes wondered why she was hated so fiercely. She searched her memories for wrongs she might have committed, but she could find none. The truth was simple, though cruel. She was hated because she reminded others of what they lacked: grace, kindness, and an unbreakable spirit. Her stepmother feared her beauty, the villagers feared her innocence, and together they allowed hatred to grow into something more dangerous than the girl could yet imagine. Unbeknownst to her, whispers of plotting had already begun. The stepmother spoke in hushed tones with those who shared her jealousy, weaving schemes that would rid her of the girl once and for all. Each whispered word was like another stone placed upon the girl's fragile shoulders, stones she could not yet see but would soon feel pressing down with all their weight. The seeds of hatred had been sown deeply, and though the girl still tried to live each day with kindness, her fate was being shaped in secret by hands that sought only her downfall. The whispers began like smoke rising in the dark, curling through the village with no clear source, until it seemed that everyone was breathing in the same poisoned air. At first, it was small things, muttered accusations that the girl brought misfortune wherever she went. A woman's pot cracked while boiling water, and someone claimed it was because the girl had touched it earlier that day. A child fell ill after playing near her, and suddenly tongues wagged that her presence carried a curse. When the rains delayed their coming, some said it was because her shadow had darkened the fields. None of it made sense, and deep down many knew these were nothing more than coincidences, yet the word spread like wildfire, because hatred always finds eager listeners. Her stepmother was at the center of it all, stoking the flames with careful lies. She would shake her head and sigh loudly whenever misfortune struck, as though she pitied the villagers, then let slip that the girl had been nearby. I have seen her stare too long into the fire, she whispered to one group. She hums strange tunes when she thinks no one is listening, she told another. To the most superstitious, she went further, hinting that she had found feathers and bones hidden in the girl's sleeping mat, trinkets planted there by her own hand. Each story was more elaborate than the last, and though none could be proven, the weight of repetition turned suspicion into conviction. It was not long before the word, which began to circle among the people. Some spat it out in anger, others whispered it in fear, but all agreed it explained why the girl seemed so different, why her kindness felt unnatural, why even the animals seemed to trust her too easily. Instead of seeing her compassion as a gift, they twisted it into evidence of dark dealings. To them, no ordinary girl could endure such cruelty and still remain gentle. There had to be something unholy sustaining her patience, some secret power she had bargained for in the shadows. One evening, when a violent storm swept through the village, tearing roofs and scattering grain, the stepmother seized her chance. She cried out that the girl had brought the storm, pointing to the way she stood in the rain, her face uplifted to the sky as if speaking with unseen forces. The villagers, frightened and desperate for someone to blame, rallied to her words. They gathered in the square, torches blazing, voices rising with the fury of a mob. The girl was dragged from her mat, her protests drowned by shouts accusing her of sorcery and betrayal. Confused and terrified, she tried to plead her innocence, but no one would listen. They shoved her forward, spitting at her, calling her names that cut deeper than any whip. Children who once clung to her skirt now hurled stones at her feet, taught by their parents to despise the one they had secretly adored. The elders, who should have been the guardians of fairness, allowed themselves to be swayed by fear. They gathered in a circle, their expressions grave, pretending to deliberate when the verdict had already been decided in their hearts. Her stepmother stood among them, her voice smooth and filled with false sorrow. She spoke of how she had tried to raise the girl as her own, how she had overlooked strange behaviors, how she had prayed that the girl would change. But now, she said, it was clear that the girl's presence was a danger to them all. She urged the elders to act before greater misfortune befell the village. Her daughters wept crocodile tears at her side, crying that they feared for their lives, that they had seen the girl's eyes glowing in the night, that she had cursed them when they refused to share food. Every word was a dagger, and though none of it was true, the crowd clung to the lies like drowning men grasping reeds. The girl stood trembling, her heart hammering in her chest, her voice shaking as she tried to speak. She told them she had never wished harm on anyone, that all she had ever wanted was peace. She reminded them of the time she had helped their children, carried water for the old, shared what little she had. But her words only fueled their anger, for to a crowd intoxicated by fear, even truth sounds like a threat. They jeered at her, shouting that kindness was only a mask for her wickedness, that she had bewitched them all along. When the judgment finally came, it was not spoken with reason but with the blind cruelty of fear. The elders declared that the girl was guilty of witchcraft, guilty of bringing ruin upon the village, guilty of betraying the trust of those who had given her a home. She was to be punished in a way that would purge the evil they believed lived within her. Her stepmother smiled faintly at the verdict, a glimmer of triumph flashing in her eyes. The girl, meanwhile, felt her knees weaken beneath her. She was not only betrayed by her family but abandoned by the very community she had served with love. As the crowd surged forward to drag her to the place of punishment, her cries were swallowed by the roar of their hatred. She looked around, searching for even one face that believed her, one voice that might speak in her defense. But there was only silence, or worse, the glares of those who once accepted her kindness now twisted into suspicion. Alone, terrified and condemned, she was swept toward her fate, not because of anything she had done, but because lies had grown into a truth too heavy for innocence to lift. The night air was heavy with smoke from torches as the villagers gathered in the square, their faces flickering between shadow and fire. The girl stood at the center, her wrists bound with rough rope, her bare feet pressed against the cold, packed earth. Every eye was on her, but none carried the warmth of recognition or compassion. Where once she had fetched water for their children, mended torn clothes, or offered a kind word to the weary, now they saw only the shadow of the lies they had been told. It was as though her very humanity had been stripped away, and in its place stood a figure onto which they could pour their fears, their envy, their anger at all the misfortunes that plagued them. The elders sat upon carved wooden stools, their walking sticks planted firmly in the ground before them, like judges holding the weight of the world in their hands. They were supposed to be the keepers of wisdom, the voices of fairness and balance. But on this night, their wisdom was drowned out by the roar of the mob. They glanced at one another, their lips tight, their brows furrowed, but none dared to go against the crowd, for even they feared what might happen if they were seen defending a girl branded as a witch. The accusations came in waves. A woman stepped forward, claiming that the girl's gaze had caused her child's sickness. Another swore she had seen the girl speaking to shadows near the river. A young man shouted that when he had rejected her smile, his crops had withered. Each testimony was more outrageous than the last, but each was greeted with nods and murmurs of agreement, as though lies layered upon lies could somehow become truth. The girl tried to speak, but her words were swallowed by jeers. When she raised her voice to declare her innocence, a stone flew from the crowd and struck her shoulder, sending her stumbling. Laughter erupted at her pain. The elders finally stood, and one of them, the oldest of all, lifted his hand for silence. His voice was low but steady, carrying the weight of finality. "The signs are clear," he said. "The girl is not like us. Wherever she goes, trouble follows. The spirits are angry and we must act to appease them." His words were not the voice of reason but a surrender to fear, a declaration that their safety mattered more than her life. The crowd roared in agreement, their cries blending into a single chant, "Bury her! Bury her! Let the earth swallow her evil." The verdict hit her like a blow to the chest. To be buried alive was not just a punishment, it was a living death, a sentence meant to erase her entirely, to silence her breath and her memory beneath the soil. Her knees buckled and she fell to the ground, but rough hands yanked her back up. Her heart raced, her throat tightened, and tears streamed down her cheeks. She searched desperately for one sympathetic face in the crowd, one person who would stand with her, but the villagers' eyes were hardened, their mouths twisted with cruelty. Even those who once accepted her help now shouted for her death, too afraid to stand against the tide of hatred. Her stepmother stepped forward, her false sorrow painted across her face like a mask. "I tried," she said, her voice trembling in mock grief. "I tried to guide her, to love her as my own. But she turned to darkness and now we all suffer. Please, elders, save us from her curse." The crowd applauded her performance, while her daughters clung to her skirts, their tears as staged as her sorrow. The girl's heart broke not only from their betrayal but from the knowledge that her death would be celebrated by those who should have been her family. The decision was carried out with ritualistic cruelty. The villagers led her in a procession, forcing her to walk barefoot over sharp stones. Children threw pebbles at her, chanting that the spirits would feast on her soul. Women spat in her path. Men shouted curses, daring her to summon her supposed powers to save herself. She stumbled under the weight of their hatred, her body bruised, her spirit crushed, yet she walked on because she had no choice. At the edge of the village, a pit had already been dug, its dark mouth gaping like the entrance to another world. The sight of it stole the breath from her lungs. The ground around it was freshly turned, the soil piled high on either side, waiting to cover her once she was lowered in. The villagers gathered around in a circle, their torches raised high, their faces glowing with the satisfaction of those convinced they were purging evil. The air was thick with dust and anticipation. The elders stood once more, reciting words that mingled tradition with fear. They spoke of cleansing the land, of driving away curses, of protecting the unborn children of the village. But beneath their solemn tones was the unmistakable thrill of power, the ability to decide life and death. When they announced the final judgment, that the girl would be buried alive so that the earth could reclaim what was unclean, the crowd erupted in cheers. To them this was justice. To her, it was a nightmare from which there was no waking. As the ropes were tightened around her wrists and ankles, she cried out one last time. "I have done no wrong. I have loved you even as you hated me. The spirits you fear know the truth and they will judge you for this." Her voice rang through the night, but it was met with mocking laughter. To the villagers, her words were nothing more than the desperate ramblings of a guilty soul. They pushed her forward, closer to the pit, ignoring her sobs, her pleas, her humanity. When the time came, they forced her down into the pit, the cold earth pressing against her skin. She looked up at the circle of faces above her, faces that had once shared food with her, faces that had once smiled at her innocence, now contorted with the satisfaction of cruelty. The first shovelful of dirt hit her shoulder, then another, until the soil began to gather around her legs. The weight of betrayal was heavier than the earth itself. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she realized that, to them, she was already gone. Above, the chants rose louder, their voices echoing against the night sky, celebrating her living death. To the girl, every sound was a nail sealing her fate. Her body trembled, her tears soaked the soil, but deep within her, something stirred, a spark not born of hatred but of something older, something beyond the reach of the villagers' cruelty. As the pit closed in around her, the village rejoiced in their verdict, blind to the truth. They were not burying evil. They were burying innocence. And innocence, when wronged so deeply, often awakens a power no soil can contain. The day of her burial began like no other, but to her, it felt as though the world itself had turned against her. At dawn, when the mist still clung to the grass and the air was heavy with silence, she was dragged from the hut where she had been held through the night. Her wrists were bound tightly with rope, her arms pulled so roughly that her skin chafed and burned. Villagers surrounded her in a grim procession, their faces painted not with sorrow but with a kind of fierce determination, as though they were marching toward victory instead of condemning an innocent girl to death. She stumbled, her bare feet cut by stones on the path, but whenever she faltered, someone shoved her forward, forcing her to keep walking. The crowd chanted under their breath, a low rhythm that grew louder with every step, "Cleanse the land, cleanse the land." The words sank into her chest like knives. Her heart pounded, every beat echoing the terror of what lay ahead. She tried to plead, her voice shaking as she called out, "I have done nothing. I have harmed no one." But her cries were drowned by the jeers of the crowd. Children, too young to understand the cruelty, threw handfuls of dirt at her as they skipped along the path. Women spat in her direction, whispering curses. Men shouted angrily, demanding that she confess to crimes she had never committed. With each insult, each accusation, she felt the world growing colder, the people she once called her own turning into strangers who wanted nothing more than to see her erased from existence. At the edge of the village, where the earth had already been torn open into a gaping pit, the scene took on the weight of ritual. Torches lined the perimeter, their flames licking at the air. The elders stood in a solemn row, holding staffs carved with symbols of power and tradition. Their voices rose in incantations meant to justify the horror they were about to commit. They spoke of sacrifice, of cleansing, of the wrath of spirits that demanded appeasement. To the villagers, these words brought reassurance, as if killing an innocent girl would bring peace to their troubled lives. To her, they were empty justifications, excuses for the hatred and envy that had festered into this moment. The girl's body trembled as they pushed her closer to the pit. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her eyes wide with terror. She wanted to scream, to run, to disappear, but her feet were trapped by the grip of men stronger than her, dragging her to the edge. She looked down and saw the darkness yawning beneath her, the earth already waiting to consume her. It was not just a hole in the ground, it was a grave, her grave, and the sight of it sent a shiver so deep through her body that she nearly collapsed. But no one reached out to catch her. Instead, rough hands shoved her forward, sending her stumbling into the shadows below. The pit was deep enough that the air grew colder within it. She landed on her knees, her palms scraping against the damp soil. She looked up, and above her was a circle of faces, their eyes sharp, their expressions hard, their silhouettes illuminated by firelight. No compassion looked down on her, no hesitation. Only hunger for her destruction. She tried one last time, her voice breaking with desperation. "Please, do not do this. The spirits know my heart. They know I am innocent." But her words were answered with the first shovelful of dirt flung into the pit. It landed across her shoulder, clinging to her skin. The sound of soil hitting the earth echoed like a drumbeat of finality. Then came another and another. Dirt began to fall in steady rhythm, clods of earth raining down on her hair, her clothes, her trembling arms. She tried to brush it off, but her bound hands made it impossible. The soil piled against her legs, pressing her down. She felt the weight growing heavier, the smell of raw earth filling her nostrils. Each handful of dirt was an act of betrayal, each shovel strike a declaration that the people she had once loved wanted her gone forever. The world above her grew smaller as the pit filled, the circle of faces narrowing, the strip of sky above dimming. Her breath quickened, panic clawing at her chest. The villagers' chanting grew louder, mingling with the scrape of shovels. Bury her, cleanse the land." Their voices echoed in her ears, drowning out even the beating of her own heart. The soil climbed higher, covering her waist, then her chest. She gasped, struggling against the ropes, her body twisting in desperation, but the more she fought, the faster the dirt seemed to fall. It pressed against her ribs, restricting her breathing, each breath a battle. Tears streaked her face, mingling with the dust, turning to muddy streaks as she cried silently into the earth. When the soil reached her shoulders, the world above was little more than a sliver of torchlight and shadows. She caught sight of her stepmother standing tall among the villagers, a faint smile curling her lips, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. That image seared itself into the girl's mind, the final cruelty of a woman who had plotted her downfall. The betrayal burned more than the soil that smothered her. Finally, the dirt rose over her face. Darkness swallowed her. The sounds of chanting and shovels muffled into distant echoes. She could no longer see the flames or the faces above her, only blackness. The pressure of the earth closed in, suffocating, heavy, relentless. Her chest heaved, her lungs screamed for air, her body trembled with the instinct to survive. Yet amid the terror, her spirit clung to one final thought. If the world had cast her away, then perhaps the spirit she had always felt but never seen would not abandon her. In that suffocating grave, surrounded by betrayal and cruelty, her fear burned, but so did something else. Something rising deep within her, waiting for its moment to awaken. Buried in the suffocating earth, the girl's world shrank to nothing but darkness, silence, and the crushing weight above her. At first, panic consumed her. Her chest rose and fell in frantic gasps as she clawed at the soil with her bound hands, but the dirt pressed tighter with every desperate movement. The air felt thick, stale, as if each breath carried less life than the last. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, though fear overpowered it. Her lips were dry, cracked from the dust that filled her mouth and throat. In that smothering void, she felt her body weakening, trembling as though it could no longer hold itself together. Yet in the darkness, as the hours stretched on, fear gave way to something stranger, something she had never known before. At first it was the whispers. Faint, almost like the rustling of leaves or the sigh of wind, they floated through the earth around her. She froze, straining to listen, certain her mind was playing tricks on her. But the voices grew clearer. They were low, melodic, speaking in a language older than the village, words she didn't fully understand but felt in her bones. The sounds soothed her trembling, wrapping her in a strange calm that clashed with the terror of her burial. She closed her eyes, though darkness already surrounded her, and let the whispers flow into her mind like water into parched soil. Visions followed. She saw figures glowing faintly in the shadows of her thoughts, tall, graceful, with faces half hidden but eyes burning like embers. Their forms shimmered as if made of smoke and light, drifting toward her. She recognized them not by their appearance but by the feeling they carried, the warmth of a grandmother's embrace, the protective watch of a father long gone, the companionship of ancestors she had never met but somehow knew. They reached out, not with hands of flesh, but with presences that touched her soul directly. One voice rose above the others, firm and steady. "Child, you are not forsaken. The earth does not bury you, it keeps you. The land remembers its own." Her tears, once of fear, turned into something new. They slid silently down her cheeks, soaking into the soil that pressed around her. She felt her fear loosen its grip as if the voices were lifting the weight from her heart even though the soil still crushed her body. Hunger no longer screamed within her. Thirst dulled into a background ache. Instead, she felt a strange strength flowing into her bones, a sense that she was not alone and never had been. The whispers guided her breathing, slow and deliberate, teaching her to take in what little air seeped through the soil. They filled her mind with images of rivers flowing beneath the desert, winds carving paths through mountains, fire flickering against the night sky. These visions told her that forces greater than men, greater than cruelty, surrounded her now. Time lost meaning. Hours might have passed, or perhaps days, but she did not count them. Instead, she drifted between waking and dreaming, between suffocating despair and luminous visions. Sometimes she saw herself standing in a field of tall grass, unbound and unbroken, her hands outstretched as the sun shone on her. Other times she saw her stepmother and the villagers, their faces twisted with greed and cruelty, only to be swallowed by shadows that rose behind them. These dreams blurred with the whispers, until she could no longer tell whether she was imagining them or being shown glimpses of truth. Then came the clearest vision. A woman stood before her, tall and radiant, her body cloaked in patterns of light resembling woven cloth. Her eyes gleamed like the stars, and when she spoke, her voice vibrated through the girl's very chest. "The earth tests you," she said. "But the earth does not hate you. Those who buried you sought your end, but they have awakened us instead. You are chosen, child, not as victim but as vessel. When the time comes, the chains of soil will break, and you will rise not with weakness but with power." The girl wanted to reach for her, to touch her, but the vision faded, leaving only warmth in the emptiness. Still it was enough. The message planted itself inside her like a seed, giving her something her stepmother and the villagers had tried to strip away: hope. Her body remained trapped, her lungs strained for air, her stomach still hollow, but her spirit felt stronger than it ever had. She no longer begged for rescue. Instead, she waited with quiet patience, believing that something greater than human hands was shaping her fate beneath the soil. She began to speak softly, not to the villagers who had condemned her, but to the unseen ones who surrounded her. "If you are truly here," she whispered, her voice raw but steady, "then let me be yours. Use me. Let my suffering not be in vain." As she spoke, she felt a faint tremor run through the ground as if the earth itself had heard her. The soil no longer felt like a grave, but like a cocoon, pressing against her body not to destroy her, but to transform her. And so she waited, her fear replaced by a strange serenity. Hunger gnawed, thirst burned, air grew thin, but her spirit clung to the promise whispered in the darkness. She was chosen. She would not die forgotten beneath the soil. When the time came, she would rise, carrying with her the strength of the ancestors and the judgment of the spirits. The villagers thought they had buried her alive, but in truth they had only planted her in the earth, and what they had planted would one day return to the surface, transformed, unstoppable, and cloaked in the power of the unseen. The moment arrived like a breath held too long, finally released. At first it was subtle, a faint trembling in the earth around her, so slight she thought it might be her own imagination. She pressed her palm against the packed soil, and there it was again, the pulse of something alive, something ancient moving beneath and above her. The ground was no longer still, it vibrated with energy like a great drum being struck from the heart of the world itself. She opened her eyes into the darkness, though she could see nothing, and yet she felt it, light. Not in the sense of sight, but in sensation, warmth blooming across her skin, radiating through the soil as though the very earth was glowing. Her chest, which had felt tight with suffocation, expanded easily for the first time in hours. Air filled her lungs as if fresh wind had been funneled into her earthen tomb. With every breath came a strange sweetness, a taste of something not of this world. The whispers that had comforted her before rose into a chorus, voices of ancestors, spirits and unseen guardians blending into a song both mournful and triumphant. The girl felt her body vibrate with their tones, as though she was no longer only herself but a vessel for something much larger. Then the soil shifted. At first it cracked softly like dried clay splitting in the sun. Then it surged and rattled as though alive. The packed weight against her chest and arms loosened, falling away in streams. She gasped as her limbs, which had been numb from pressure, began to feel the rush of freedom. The chains of soil that had pinned her, meant to suffocate her, broke apart in glowing fragments. Each clod of earth shimmered faintly before dissolving into dust that floated weightlessly, surrounding her like sparks of fire. She looked down at her wrists and saw them no longer bound by shadow, but glowing with symbols, patterns resembling woven lines, spirals, and stars etched into her skin by unseen hands. Fear fled from her heart in that instant. What replaced it was awe, an overwhelming recognition that she was no longer powerless. The spirits had heard her, and they had chosen to act through her. Her body felt stronger than it ever had, her pulse steady and unshaken. Where once hunger gnawed, now she felt only fullness. Where thirst had burned, now a cool stream seemed to run through her veins. She was alive, not only alive but transformed, reborn in the womb of the earth itself. The trembling grew violent, shaking the ground above. Villagers who had left her buried stirred in the night, woken by the quakes. They rushed out of their huts, staring at the ground that rolled like waves under their feet. A strange glow seeped up from the soil where they had buried her, faint at first and then bright, as if the earth had swallowed lightning and was releasing it now. The villagers cried out in fear, some falling to their knees, whispering prayers they had long forgotten. The stepmother, who had watched her burial with cruel satisfaction, clutched at her chest, a sick dread creeping into her bones. She knew in her heart that something unnatural, something beyond her control, was awakening. Beneath that earth the girl rose slowly. Not by her own effort, but lifted by a power that flowed through her like a river. Her arms stretched out, pressing against the soil, and it yielded to her as though it recognized her claim. She no longer struggled. She no longer feared. The ground was no longer her enemy, it was her ally, moving aside to let her through. She felt its strength rushing into her muscles, its patience steadying her heartbeat, its ancient memory fusing with her own. Her eyes snapped open in the dark, and though buried, she could see. Not with mortal vision but with sight gifted by the spirits. She saw the lines of power connecting her to the land, glowing threads that ran through roots, rocks and rivers. She saw her ancestors standing tall behind her, their forms glowing brighter now, their voices urging her forward. She understood in that moment. She had been buried not to end her story but to begin it. The earth was not her grave. It was her place of transformation, her rebirth. With a final surge, the soil around her exploded outward, showering the night with glowing dust. Villagers screamed and stumbled back as the ground split open, releasing the girl who should have been dead. She rose from the pit, her body cloaked in light, her eyes reflecting the fire of unseen worlds. The chains that had once bound her rattled across the ground, but now they were broken, twisted, powerless. Instead, it seemed as though the fragments of those chains bowed at her feet, coiling like serpents ready to serve her rather than restrain. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Some fell to their knees, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Others ran, believing her to be a spirit returned to judge them. Her enemies clutched each other in terror, their faces drained of color. The girl looked upon them, not with hatred but with a calm so deep it unnerved them more than rage ever could. She was no longer their victim. She was something they could never have imagined, a living vessel of the spirit's power chosen by the earth itself. And within her, energy surged still, growing brighter, steadier, unbreakable. The voices whispered one last time, not as distant echoes but as truths rooted in her soul. You are ours and we are yours. Walk and the earth will follow. Speak and the winds will answer. Rise and justice will rise with you. The night air was heavy, still clinging to the scent of freshly disturbed earth where her body had been hidden beneath the soil. At first there was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that made villagers feel safe, convincing them that the girl had been swallowed by the ground forever. Yet as the hours crept forward, strange sounds began to ripple through the quiet, a faint trembling, a muffled crack, like the roots of old trees being wrenched apart. Those closest to the burial site froze in place, their blood running cold as the earth shifted unnaturally. No wind blew, no animal stirred, yet the ground itself seemed restless. Mothers clutched their children tightly, and whispers spread like wildfire, carrying fear before proof had even arrived. Then suddenly a thin, sharp ray of light pierced through the soil. It wasn't the glow of a torch or the glimmer of moonlight but something otherworldly, golden and pulsing as if alive. Gasps filled the air as the mound where she lay began to heave upward, as though something beneath it rejected the weight of death. A hand, small but steady, broke through the dirt, caked in soil yet glowing faintly as though marked by the spirits themselves. Screams erupted from those who had gathered to witness, some falling to their knees, others stumbling backward in disbelief. The villagers who had thrown handfuls of earth over her body earlier that day could hardly breathe as they saw her head pushed through, strands of hair matted with dirt but her eyes alight with an unnatural fire. She dragged herself upward with a strength she had never possessed before, each motion deliberate, unstoppable. The ground seemed to help her rise, loosening its grip, crumbling away as though eager to release what it could no longer contain. The darkness she had been buried in gave way to a halo of light that seemed to embrace her figure, outlining her against the night sky like a living miracle. Those who had plotted her death staggered back, their lips trembling, words caught in their throats. The stepmother's face drained of color, her pride and cruelty shattered in an instant as her eyes met the girl's. This was not the frightened child they had condemned, nor the victim who had begged for mercy before being lowered into the earth. This was someone transformed, someone untouchable, carrying the silent weight of spirits that could not be denied. The villagers began to murmur prayers, some out of awe, others out of guilt, but all sensing that they were standing at the edge of something greater than human power. The girl stood fully upright at last, her chest rising and falling, but her posture unshaken, her figure taller than anyone remembered. Soil still clung to her skin, yet it seemed to glow faintly in patterns that looked like ancient markings, as if the earth had gifted her its wisdom and strength. Her eyes, once filled with tears and fear, now blazed with a clarity that cut through every shadow. The villagers dared not move too close. It was as though an invisible barrier surrounded her, protecting her from every hand that once sought to harm her. One child broke the silence by crying out in terror, and the sound triggered chaos. Some villagers dropped their tools and fled toward their huts, unwilling to look upon her return. Others fell to the ground in worship, certain that the spirits themselves had risen her up as a warning. The elders exchanged panicked glances, their authority trembling under the weight of what they had just witnessed. And in the midst of it all, her enemies shook violently, unable to believe that their plan had been undone so completely. The girl's gaze swept across the faces in the crowd, pausing on each person who had cast stones, whispered lies, or turned away in her time of need. Her silence was heavier than words, and it forced them to look inward at their own guilt. Yet when her eyes locked on her stepmother, the woman stumbled backward, her pride breaking apart like dry clay. The girl did not shout, did not curse, but her very presence was enough to make the woman's knees buckle. Above them, the moon pushed through the clouds, its silver light mingling with the glow that still clung to the girl's body. It was as if the sky itself bore witness to her rising, affirming her transformation. She had been buried in shame, but she rose in strength. She had been cast down in cruelty, but she returned in the embrace of the spirits. And with every breath she took, the villagers realized that their world would never be the same again. The silence that hung after her rising did not last. The air shifted, heavy with a presence that no one could ignore. A cold wind swept through the village, though no storm stirred in the sky, and with it came whispers, ancient voices that seemed to rise from the soil itself. The villagers shivered as they recognized the sound of spirits. The earth trembled lightly beneath their feet, not enough to collapse homes, but enough to remind them that something vast and unseen was moving among them. Those who had condemned the girl looked around in terror, unable to decide if they should run or kneel. The first to be struck was one of the men who had laughed the loudest during her burial. He staggered suddenly, clutching his head as if invisible hands pressed down on his skull. He screamed a high, broken cry, and began tearing at his own clothes as though they were aflame. His eyes rolled back and his voice choked into meaningless babble. Madness claimed him where he stood, and the crowd drew away horrified. It was clear to all, this was no ordinary illness, no fever or curse spoken by humans. This was punishment woven by the spirits, swift and inescapable. Another of the conspirators, a woman who had hurled handfuls of earth into the grave with spiteful delight, found her legs stiffening beneath her. She tried to run, but her feet dragged as though the ground itself clutched at her ankles. The soil beneath her hardened like stone, swallowing her feet little by little. She shrieked for help, clawing at the dirt with frantic hands, but no one dared to approach. Her voice cracked into silence as the earth closed over her legs up to her knees, binding her as surely as chains. She was left screaming, half-buried, tasting the terror she had once forced on the innocent girl. The stepmother, whose hatred had driven the entire act, stood paralyzed. Her lips trembled and her hands shook, but she could not take her eyes from the girl who now glowed with unearthly strength. She tried to speak, perhaps to deny, perhaps to beg for mercy, but no words came. Instead, her mouth filled with the bitter taste of soil, her tongue thick with dirt as though the earth itself sought to silence her forever. She coughed and choked, spitting clumps of mud as she fell to the ground, writhing in helplessness. The villagers gasped, some shielding their faces, others weeping, realizing that the very powers they had ignored were now delivering judgment. The sky, calm just moments before, rumbled with low thunder. A streak of pale lightning forked across the horizon, not striking the earth but illuminating the village with a ghostly glow. In that light, the guilty looked smaller, weaker, like shadows stripped of their arrogance. The spirits had chosen their targets and no one could intervene. Madness spread among the conspirators, some clawing at their own hair, others stumbling blindly as though lost in a nightmare only they could see. One man, who had shouted for her burial more than anyone, fell into convulsions, foam spilling from his lips, until he lay still with wide, staring eyes. The villagers, who had once cheered her suffering, now stood in stunned silence. Many sank to their knees, whispering apologies into the dust, begging the unseen powers for forgiveness. Parents clutched their children, warning them to never again mock the innocent, never again follow cruelty without thought. The girl, still glowing faintly, remained standing, her presence both terrifying and awe-inspiring. She did not raise a hand, did not speak a curse. Her silence itself confirmed that this was not her doing. The spirits acted of their own will, restoring balance where humans had broken it. Her enemies' punishment did not end quickly. Some were marked with exile, their minds too fractured to live among others. They wandered into the wilderness, driven by whispers only they could hear, destined never to return. Others were left humiliated, bound in shame as the villagers turned their backs on them, refusing them food or shelter. And those who had been consumed most deeply by malice met their end that very night, struck down by forces invisible yet undeniable. By dawn, the village carried a new weight. No one spoke lightly anymore, no one laughed at cruelty. The mound where she had been buried now stood like a warning, a place people would point to for generations as proof that the spirits saw all things. Children were taught that day's lesson before they could walk. To mock innocence was to invite destruction, to bury the blameless was to bury yourself. The girl's survival and the punishment of the guilty were not just events. They became the heartbeat of a new law, one written not by men, but by forces greater than them all. The girl herself looked upon the wreckage not with vengeance but with solemnity. She bore the scars of suffering, yet her spirit carried no bitterness. She had become more than herself, an instrument of balance, a reminder that the spirits chose whom to protect and whom to destroy. When her eyes turned to the villagers, they bowed their heads in silence, humbled and shaken. Justice had spoken and none could deny it,